Welcome to this week's episode of Trista's Plate Story podcast. I'm Trista Polo from iwokeupawesome.com, and I am your host. Each week we learn the story behind that vanity plate. You know, the one you saw driving down the road? What did it say? What did it mean? Why did they choose it? Welcome. I'm so excited for this week. We have Ashley Wellman from Fort Worth, Texas. Her license plate is I Heart Fresno. When we had our initial call, I was like, oh my gosh, I can't wait for the actual interview. Welcome, Ashley.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here.
I'm excited to have you. Now, let's jump right into your plate story because I want to hear why you chose it, but also how you were able to have I Heart Fresno as your plate.
Okay, so it's funny because when I meet people, they'll say, I'll be walking in the car, they're like, oh, you're from Fresno, California. And I'm like, no, it has nothing to do with that. So the picture I actually submitted to you when we first started talking was me with a skeleton skull in my hand, along with my license plate, I Heart Fresno. So the way that came about is my now 6-year-old Reagan, her best friend is named Fresno. And that wouldn't be very special, except for the fact that Fresno happens to be a 3-foot posable skeleton who has been in our family for the last 4 years. When she was 2, I'm a criminologist. So she adopted Fresno he's an office prop of mine. And she said, you can't take him away. That's my best friend, Fresno. And it's like a dog. She had named him. And so as a family, we were kind of stuck with this posable skeleton who since has really added so much fun and joy to our lives. He goes on trips with us. He goes to the movies. He takes naps and baths and all kinds of things with my daughter. So it's been hilarious. It's been a cool adventure, but it would have never made a license plate except for the fact that after tragedy hit our family, I decided to write a children's book, right? What else should a criminologist do? But transition to become a children's author. And the main character
makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, of course, so approachable. But the main character in the book is Fresno, and of course Reagan, who's the girl who dances with skeletons. And so as I'm starting to plan this, right, one of the first things I did was, how can I brand the Fresno brand? And one of my friends was like, you should get a vanity tag. And I had always kind of been one of those people that went, I don't know, do I really want to draw attention to my car with my family and those kinds of things? And I thought, yeah, with this, I really do. I didn't want necessarily one of those stickers on the back of my car, but I wanted a talking point. And so I told my friend, I said, how many years should I get for this vanity tag? 1, 3, or 5? And I remember him saying, well, it kind of depends on how much you believe in yourself and the brand. And I thought, well, 5 years it is. So I signed up for my license plate. And in Texas, the unique thing is that there's a couple symbols you can pick to add to the background of the license plate. And so what I actually registered was I space Fresno. But when I registered it, I actually put I star Fresno, and that translated to being printed as I Heart Fresno. So I just got very clever with the options on the license plate, and here I go. Now I drive around in my Honda Pilot with I Love Fresno on the back, and I get to explain the story to people who ask.
That's awesome. There's so much I love about that. I love that you used the story of your daughter's childhood companion to deal with tragedy, like as a catharsis. Mm-hmm. And it seems like it really did the job. Like it really gave you something special to heal with.
It really did. So in 2018, the tragedy that hit our family, we had just moved to Texas, brand new in Texas. I was about to start this dream job, progression. I'm a professor of criminology. And so I had actually taken a huge career step back to move my family to Texas and kind of start over to rebuild my career as a professor. And the day before I started at my new university, my husband died in front of my daughter and I due to a pulmonary embolism. It was out of nowhere. He was young, healthy, beautiful human being. And in that moment, I'm here in this new state. I'm, alone. We don't really have people to help us grieve and cope. And one of my very dear friends said, Ash, what if you used creative writing as a way to step away from the heavy research you do? I actually work with homicide survivors and sexual assault survivors. And so that had always been a passion of mine because I didn't know the trauma and I couldn't really relate to the people I worked with. But in that moment after his death, it was one of those things that said, maybe creative writing could let me step back from very trauma-informed, very trauma-heavy research and really focus on healing my daughter and I. And that was the impetus of that book. And now it's become this really, like you said, this thing that we have ownership over, this brand and this business that even my 6-year-old, she's like this co-CEO with me. And it's just been so much fun. And now seeing how that story is impacting other families, it's amazing. It's so magical.
Well, I am so sorry to hear about your husband, and just hearing you had told me before, and just hearing you tell me again, I came right back to the horror and the sadness and the grief that I'm feeling just hearing what you guys went through. So I really am sorry to hear about
Thank you
that.
so much.
I love that you partnered up with your daughter to get through it together,
Yeah. That was
because
really important for us.
yeah,
Yeah, as an advocate, I had so often told my families the importance of grieving as an individual and grieving as a family unit. And so when he passed away, I really felt like, oh my God, I hope what I've been telling people is valuable information, because I'm going to have to follow this advice. And so very much dedicated to saying, okay, I need to grieve. I need to grieve as a mother, but also as a wife and as a friend. And then I need to make sure Reagan grieves and we grieve together. So I didn't shield her from a lot. And she was only 4 at the time. I made sure she saw me cry. I made sure she saw me fail at things, to be angry, to be quick to laughter, like all of these different feelings we have in grief. And I really do think that was one of the biggest blessings we gave each other, was kind of that authentic, transparent grief, because now we're so much closer. And when one of us is really struggling, there's a lot of understanding, even her being 6 and me being, this ripe old 36. It's really cool. It's been a powerful journey, a hard journey, but a very powerful journey, because I got to do it with her. That's the biggest gift that Buddy, my husband, left me, was this baby that got to really be my best friend and kind of companion throughout everything.
yeah. And how's she doing with everything 2 years later?
We have our moments. The thing that I am so amazed by is she's able to articulate her journey and her experience and her love for her dad and the things that she misses and feels. She'll, like, just the other day, she's like, I'd do anything if daddy could snuggle me again, or I really miss daddy's snuggles, or do you think dad would be proud of me? So we have moments of tears and kind of just, kind of regression back to the beginning stages of grief, like everybody. But now I more so see her articulate emotion, and I also see her use her experience to help others. So she, that's what the book is about for us. But even in her personal life, we got a message on Facebook that said, my niece just lost her sister. She's only 6. Can you offer me any advice? And I said, well, would you want Reagan to talk to Tessa? We bonded over that. And Reagan was able to call another 6-year-old and talk to her about, like, it's okay to be sad, and your sister's always going to be a part of your life. And if you ever miss her, you can just put your hands here and know she's in your heart. And, this is a 6-year-old able to almost offer grief support to another 6-year-old. And now that's this really precious friendship that focuses on so much more than grief, but started with a 6-year-old having the ability to communicate and articulate how she's processed grief and how she can be there for another friend. So in the midst of the horror of his death, you see so many beautiful moments that I go, it's so obvious that he had set us up for this life of magic. And I know he'd do anything if he could be here to witness it, but now he's just up in heaven eating donuts and watching us, like really fulfill this plan of joy. And it's just exciting.
That's great. I think people struggle with, how do you interact with a child around grief, especially such a close loss, like a parent, even a grandparent, somebody they have so much connection with. And it's hard to know what the right thing for the child is. You don't want to traumatize them for life, but you don't want to shield them so they can't go through the process themselves. So navigating that has got to be very challenging. And I really acknowledge you.
Thank you.
For bringing all of your training right to your doorstep, and then even being able to pay that forward in having her make a difference for another child. That's just amazing.
For me, I knew, and the hardest part was literally as I kissed him goodbye in the hospital, I'm like, I have to go home and tell a 4-year-old who watched her dad die in our home, right? I had followed him to the emergency room with hopes of he'd be resuscitated, but I knew the moment I kissed him goodbye, I said, I have to go tell her, and I have to tell her the truth, because I think we do want to shield our kids from things and say things like, oh, he went to sleep, or he's flying in the sky now. Like, no, I had to start with the honest fact. Your dad is not coming home. He passed away. He's dead. And that's very very heavy and almost feels impossible to do. I mean, I remember going like, I can't say this out loud. And I remember the moment I did and her reaction and the wailing and the things that happened after that. But then because I was honest and because I used real words and because I never didn't answer a question from her honestly, like, was he scared? Did he hurt? You know, like, do you think they hurt him at the hospital? Like, she would ask very adult questions about a very adult situation. And I think we would love to believe that kids don't understand and they can't process those things. I think they process it on such a pure level that it's very real to them. And so honesty, real words, you know, like I remember someone in a support group, they said, oh, I told her that their dad, you know, was in the sky with planes flying, and that, you know, he just liked being up there. And so when they got on an airplane, they all started crying because they said, I thought we'd see him because he's supposed to be up in the heaven, you know, up in the sky, just flying like an airplane. And she hadn't really given them a concrete reality of what had happened to their dad. They didn't understand he was actually dead. And so the importance of our words and the acknowledgement of our kids' ability to understand heavy things, that was really eye-opening to me. And one of the things I did right when everything happened is I rushed to Barnes and Noble and I got every kid's book on bereavement. Not always what I really needed, but I just said, like, I'll use any tool possible. And I was so grateful here in Texas, anyone who's listening in Texas, there's actually a center called The Warm Place right here in Fort Worth that is a nonprofit that allows kids 3 to 25, I believe, to process those immediate deaths in their family, no matter what the cause of the death. And that literally was a lifesaver for us. That professional help, as good as I was as a scholar understanding grief, loss, and trauma, I knew I needed professional help with her and me. So important, the honesty, the directness, and really this idea to let her learn her story of grief and trauma.
Yeah, absolutely. And getting professional support, whether it's books and therapy groups, I think that was a huge benefit, I'm sure, because they know how to help navigate that. Now, you've dealt with tragedy in your job, in your profession, your whole life. You're a criminologist, but you don't just deal with any kind of criminology. You deal with actually like cold cases, right? Like unsolved mysteries.
Yeah, I do. And so it's funny because if I say, oh, I'm a criminologist, people immediately, even my parents, will say, oh yeah, like the CSI stuff, that's what she does. It's not. I study why and how crime occurs, what and, you know, how the impact of crime occurs in our communities, how society kind of works, you know, with law and those types of things. And so I'm much more of the sociologist studying the events that surround, you know, crime. And so when I started, my passion, like any other woman in the United States, was true crime, murder. I wanted to understand, you know, how and why murder occurs. And I really wanted to know the offender perspective, the case investigation. And so I started working in a cold case unit. And I said, okay, I want to learn everything I can. I want to do my dissertation, which is basically a book about cold case processes. And then a mom came in and she just said, I want to know what the expletive happened to my daughter. And I want to make sure you're working her case. And she was so upset. And at the time I was 25, they pulled me out and they said, Ashley will tell you what happened to her. And I thought, I will? Oh my God. So I went out and I talked to her, and I really didn't talk. I listened. And I learned from her that she said, I drove from New Jersey down to Florida at the time, right? For nothing except to make sure they remembered her name, that they were working her case, that they knew how much I loved her and how important she was to her family. And I thought, my God, this has been almost 15 years. And she's almost as raw as if it had happened yesterday. And she's desperate to know that her daughter mattered. And that's when my whole perspective shifted. And I really started saying, instead of the typical, oh, I want to know what happens in the crime and I'm intrigued by the offender, I was moved deeply by the family members left behind, especially in these unsolved murders, because there is no resolution. There is no one to blame. There's no one held accountable. And so I started studying the grief, loss, and trauma that surrounds these unsolved murders, then started working with police departments about how to work with homicide survivors in general. And as a college professor, I stepped up to be a sexual assault advocate, working alongside men and women who have been sexually assaulted, both on and off campus, to help understand really their journey and guide them through different options that they have after a sexual assault. So beyond powerful. I don't offer them nearly as much as I've gained from the people that I work with, from my students, from people brave enough to share their stories. So that is what gave me power when I suffered my own trauma. I said, I've witnessed so many families in the midst of the most horrific moment of their life have grace, find joy, find appreciation, right? Struggle, but survive. And so I knew I was going to be okay, mainly because of the people that I worked with. So my job has been just fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, can you tell me like, how does it become a cold case? How long does it have to be? What makes it a cold case versus an open case? Is it just that they
Yeah.
run out of leads?
It really is. So there is no universal definition for cold case homicides. A cold case doesn't necessarily mean it's not being worked, but it means that there clearly cannot be the same resources and the same detectives working that case, because it's not, there's so many more cases coming in, right? So my definition and what I started my research with was from a man named Walton. And he said that a cold case homicide is typically at least a year old. There's no new leads in the case, right? They've been exhausted as of now. Or the original detective has retired or isn't working that case anymore, and it's been shifted over to new detectives. And so a lot of times families will hear, oh, my case is cold, and they assume it's what it sounds like, that it's really put away and it's done, that it's this closed, file. Not always.
It makes me think of like they've given up.
Right. And not
Yeah.
always. In fact, sometimes there's a breath of fresh air if your case gets moved over to a cold case unit. It's new eyes, it's young detectives, it's someone dedicated to making sure they can follow up. And as crazy as it sounds, at some point, time, which actually works against detectives, right? And against evidence and all these things, at some point, there's this shift that time actually benefits the case. And so it sounds crazy, but if you think about it, maybe at the time of a murder, I'm married to somebody who I suspect killed somebody, right? But 10 years later, we've gone through a divorce. 10 years later, they passed away. 10 years later, I'm, willing to share something, or I need to get out of the marriage or something like that. So I might come forward. Witnesses may not feel threatened, or they've moved, or they've been able to say, this is weighed heavily on me. I'm going to come forward. Evidence and scientific inquiry grows with time, right? There's so many new tests we have now that if evidence has been preserved, time's a benefit. Think about DNA. I mean, we used to be able to test, is it A or B blood? Now we can literally, just from a speck, and not even blood, just from a speck, we can develop a face, a prototype, right? Of like, this is who this person's going to look like. This is their heritage. This is all this. The genealogy stuff that you're seeing right now, made famous from the Golden State Killer investigation, but that's been happening for years, where people submit their DNA and say, I think, like, I'd like to contribute to a database to see if anyone in my family it's fascinating. So in a cold case unit, sometimes you're given a gift of, this case is getting a breath of fresh air breathed back into it. One of the things I really advocate for with those detectives is just a sense of communication and consistency, and being available to the family members, as difficult as that is, because the answer is typically, I don't have an answer for you. I don't have progress in your case. But even that allows a family to say, but they haven't forgotten. They answered my call. They gave me 5 minutes. I know that they remember her name. They let me share her name. They let me tell them how important she is, or he is, right? And then there's peace in that. So there's so much value in that relationship with the family and the detective. It's very, very cool to watch that play out when it's done right. And if it's not done right, to see how detrimental those relationships can be to survivors is also a very, very powerful thing that we have to pay attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you work directly with families. What role do you take in that whole process?
So honestly, I've been more of an advocate figure, or someone who's more of just a resource. The thing is I'm not the expert in cold case homicides. I tell people that all the time. I just happen to be Dr. Ashley Wellman, which gives me a really unique platform. And I happen to be pretty, rambunctious, and I'm willing to kind of be scrappy and fight for people to gain resources, to try to change policies, to try to educate law enforcement, the media, the families. So I'm much more of a resource advocate for them. It's no official capacity. I serve on several boards for homicide survivors. I've been key in different events to raise resources, to raise attention, to try to rewrite legislation, things like that. But honestly, I just happen to be a professor using our platform and guiding our research towards it. And families have been willing to share with me their experience and been willing to tell me their story so that I'm able to keep that fight going.
You're like the Brene Brown of murder.
Oh my God, that's the biggest compliment ever. That should be my tagline. That should
I
be my
think
tagline.
so.
Yes, I'll ask her permission. I'll call her.
Okay. I think that's probably a good idea. But I mean, it's important what you're doing, right? Gathering the data, because you're an analyst as well. And so you're looking at the numbers and you're looking at the trends and that kind of thing. So tell me a little bit about some of the cases. Let's have some good news, like some of the cases that actually got resolution, because I know that that's what the families are looking for. They're looking for justice for resolution.
Okay, so here's the interesting. Let me talk about this first. I just wrote a paper, I think last year, about the hope that families have and the expectations that cold case families have, even 10, 20, 40 years later after the death of their loved one. There is an ultimate joy and optimism and hope that I will one day know who killed my loved one. And there's also a lot of pressure that families put on themselves and on the system to say, once that happens, once I get justice, right? And justice, to me, once you understand that justice doesn't always, or very rarely happens, but once I get a resolution in this case, I'm then going to have peace. And that's the moment I can start to heal. And one of the things I've really encouraged my families is you can't wait for that ultimate resolution. You have to heal in the moment and with the circumstance that you have, because you're robbed of 10, 20, 40 years when you continue to believe that one piece of evidence is going to change your grief structure. And so what I talk about in this paper is that these ideas that we don't think about is that when the case gets solved, right, there's this expectation that now I can grieve and be whole and heal, but solutions can bring devastating results as well. A trial is no joke for a family. I've had families who have had their cases solved say, I'm worse off now for what I experienced in the courtroom. The way the prosecutor talked, showed pictures to the jury to inflame the jury. The way the defense described my loved one as this horrible person, this prostitute, this worthless woman, right? Those things can be devastating to a family. And the outcome is often not what's expected. So like in my head, if I think about, okay, God forbid I lost my child, and I'm hoping that a case is going to come about, a offender is going to be caught, they're going to be prosecuted. In my head, I want the ultimate punishment, which is either life in prison without parole, depending on who you talk about. That could be worse than some people said, or the death penalty. That's what I want. Well, very rarely, 20 years after the fact, is that going to be what you get. The offender could be dead. The offender could be someone you know. So imagine finding out it's your cousin or your uncle or something like that who killed your loved one. Now I have to process again, like I've lost two people. Now what kind of punishment do I want, right? And the other thing is that rarely is anyone going to get the death penalty if that's the expectation. Very, very rarely. Less than 1% are even considered for it. And then beyond that, very, very rarely. And it's only going to be if it's an African-American killing a white person is really that's the most common death penalty application. And so the expectations of that court process can often outweigh the actual benefit that comes from the court process. Now, that doesn't mean that these families aren't hopeful and don't want a resolution and aren't joyful when there's a resolution. One family I worked with down in Florida, the young girl had gone jogging after, in this college town. And it was, I think, 25 years later that they found a journal of an inmate who had recorded the multiple murders he had done. And one of the descriptions was of this young girl, Tiffany. And so they linked that case. So, and then from that, they actually found DNA that matched another case that they were working that they had often thought was linked. So both of those families of cases I had worked found that resolution. Another family, Michelle Mechie, who's one of the most powerful mothers and women and advocates. She runs Corey's Network in Kansas City, which is an organization that fights for unsolved murders and families of homicide. Her son was killed. She actually held him as he died. And she told the police immediately, I know who did this. It's this young man. And they didn't believe her. And so they actually started to blame her other sons and her family. And they started making these really awful claims about sexuality and all of these things to shame the family. Sure enough, she hired a private investigator. And 7 years later, they arrested and convicted this kid of murdering her son. And it was the man she said 7 years earlier. So there's a lot of just like the fight and the determination, we always hear about like the mother's love or, someone advocating for someone else. It is fearless fighting. And now Shelley can sit back and say, okay, my job is done in that realm. And now she's starting to focus on her own health. So there is joy and there is a lot of work that happens after those resolutions occur. So yeah, it's complicated. There's hope, there's disappointment, there's a lot of work that happens, even if a resolution is reached.
Wow, it's so much. There are so many more layers than I ever would have thought. And it never occurred to me that the resolution might be worse than the not knowing.
Can you imagine your other son? Like, let's say you have two kids, one's murdered, and then, for years you're fighting. And then all of a sudden you realize it's your other son. It's your ex-husband. It's your uncle. And that happens. You're most likely to be killed by someone or at least a friend, right? And so the very first mother I ever talked to, she said, my biggest fear is that one of the young men who held my hand when my son died also killed him. Like, that's my very real fear. And I thought in my head, I went, that is very, very possible. And she knew it. She knew that it was more likely someone who was helping her grieve than someone who was a stranger on the outside. And so, yeah, we don't think about those things. We don't think about the forced interaction with practitioners. So these families, grief in general, like my grief was horrific, but it was between my daughter and I and my family. These families have to deal with the police constantly, sometimes saying that they might have killed the person, right? So there's that added layer, or that someone in their family killed them, right? There's forced media interaction. The media is not kind to victims. They want to paint that you're safe and the victims, there's a reason they got killed. So it's because she was a dancer. It's because she smoked weed. It's because of this and that. So they paint this really ugly picture, but families feel forced to continue that dialogue with the media because at least my family member is in the media. So you can slam her all you want, but people see her name and I'll keep talking to you so that you cover her. Bereavement groups can be devastating to families because sometimes I don't need to hear 12 other people's heartbreaking story. So there's a lot of things we don't think about, that forced interaction, and then grief in general. Society is terrible of helping grieving individuals, whether it's murder or a natural death. We say things like, oh, he's in a better place. This was God's plan. You should be over it by now. You're not grieving enough. You're grieving too much. So poor things. I mean, grief in general is a mess, but then you add violent crime to it and it's even worse.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to give a shout out to a previous episode. The license plate was GPS Hope, and they help families whose children have died before them. So it's not necessarily violent reasons, but she was saying that 5 years is a typical average amount of time to have the grief feel like it happened yesterday.
Yeah.
And that it's that raw, especially when it's somebody that was your child, even as an adult child still, that it's just, horrific to get over, and then add the violence to it.
Right. The unexplained,
that's a whole other layer. Right.
Unnecessary. The thing is we have the Kubler-Ross model. And even as a griever, we want directions of how should I grieve? And there's this feeling of failure when I'm not following these nice little stepping stones that aren't real. And there's an expectation of people who haven't experienced significant trauma to say, she should have been over it. Like, I remember going back to work 4 months later and it being in my office crying because something had triggered me. And a colleague that I thought was a dear friend came in and said, like, if you're still crying, like in a couple months or a year from now, you need to get some serious help. And I looked at her and I thought, if you only knew the help I've been getting and the fight I've been fighting every morning to show up here, right? Then you'd give me a lot of grace, or you could extend some grace. But even now, like, I mean, there's moments. Just the other day, my daughter was flipping through a photo album in my parents' house. We had gone home and it was all of her dad holding her when she was a baby. And she kind of got choked up and she said, I wish I had known him more and I wish he was here. And just that moment, it set off everything, right? It's Christmas time. I wish he was here, all of these things. And I'm thinking, why does she know that at age 6? She should know that kind of pain. She watched him pass away. So it's like, even 2 years later, even when I'm happy, even when I'm making really brilliant strides, I have moments where it feels like I'm still holding him in the hallway, and I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. And so I've learned grace. I've learned how to step up for friends that I wasn't necessarily there for in the right way. because I've experienced it. And so one of the biggest things I can offer your listeners is just being full of grace, whether you're the griever or you're the person who's in someone's life who's experienced significant loss. There is no beautiful way to heal. And the journey's so unique for every single person. Let them struggle a little bit. Allow them, some permission to not necessarily be themselves, and realize that the person that they're going to become eventually is going to be a new version, because you're not ever going to be the old person after that. But they'll be okay, and they'll be back to being your great friend and laughter and things like that. But the messy parts are allowed, and they don't diminish the character of that person. It's just a struggle. And some days I remember things where I'm like, God, that really wasn't me, and I remember same girl had said, like, you're just not the person I fell in love with. And I thought, well, I'm trying, like, I'm really trying. So it's interesting because we have an expectation, and it just doesn't work like that. 20 years later,
Yeah.
I'm sure at Reagan's wedding, part of it will be her daddy's not there to see her. I'll rejoice in the fact that probably another amazing human is there to walk her down the aisle, and that, she's had many people love her, but there's still going to be moments the rest of my life that I say, yeah, I miss him. He was a beautiful part of our life, and that's okay.
And I think that that's the thing, is nobody can really know what you're going through, whether it's grief from a natural or from a violent crime. There's so many layers that we don't show, even our close knit circle. And so having the grace for others, and just making an assumption that maybe you don't know what's going on for them.
Maybe it's
giving them the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
And just give somebody the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah. And I think, people will call me all the time. They're like, Ashley, I know this other widow, her daughter's 3. Like, I need you to talk to her because you know what she's going through. And I said, careful. I will totally talk to her. I'd love to talk to her, but I will not understand what she's going through for many reasons, right? Because of what was her relationship like with her husband? What's her bond like with her daughter? What's her personality? What's her mental health disposition? What's her financial resources, right? So there's many times where I say, I can give you an experience, and I can share in the shared experience of just humanity. And I can give you advice of what worked for our family. But I also am going to warn you very heavily that this may not work for you. And you may walk a very different journey, right? One of my dearest friends also lost her husband. It was my husband's best friend, died almost a year before him due to a heart attack. So it was crazy because we're both these very young families. We had watched, my friend lose her husband to a heart attack. And I think that's what prompted my husband to take care of so many things for us, right? I studied murder, but then he watched his best friend pass away and didn't think about at age 40 that I might die, and didn't have things in place. So that allowed us to learn what we needed for our family. And so I tell her all the time, like, thank you for being honest about your struggles, because it helped our family when we didn't know we even needed the help. And so even someone who's suffered the almost exact same death, right? I don't necessarily have the same journey she has. And so even understanding that, like, I am now so graceful with people who like have lost their spouse. And I don't say she should be further. She should be okay. It's nope. Her journey's so different than mine.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're doing such good work advocating, supporting. I know that you're a keynote speaker in a lot of conferences around these topics. You were just given the 40 under 40 in 2020. Congratulations.
Thank you
in the
so
Fort
much.
Worth Business Journal. That's awesome. And, just thank you for all the work you're doing. This is very dark material. Like, you're dealing with people's most traumatic events, and you're standing for the right resolution and their hope not being extinguished and the best possible outcome. And I just really thank you for that. I know I don't have the stomach for it, so I'm glad you do, because these people need people in their corner helping them with more than just the investigation.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's crazy too that then the book, My Friend Fresno, is now also kind of that grief help story without being about grief. So when I wrote that story, right, it was a break for me. And now I have families that I'm working with in other capacities with special needs children, with children who have been bullied, children who have been sexually abused. And they say, my child can find themselves in Fresno and realize that even though they're now different, even though they've struggled, even though they haven't been treated kindly, they can still have a beautiful life and they can still find like self-acceptance and value. And we as a family can learn from Reagan's character, which is this support person who just fearlessly loves Fresno, right? And can realize that these things that are scary, like death, like grief, like abuse, all of the things that I work with on a professional level. In the book, there's a line that says, the things that scare us most are often just misunderstood. And so what a powerful message for all of us about things like sexuality, racial differences, religious differences, all those things that scare us and separate us. It's really this barrier that we put on it because we misunderstand or we don't take time to get to know somebody. But if we did, right? If you take time to get to know grief, get to know trauma, get to know, the effects of bullying and those types of things, is it scary or is it just misunderstood? And if we learn it, could we then start to dance with the things that have happened to us or the things that scare us? Could we just dance with them instead and have a much richer life? So it's wild because in the back of my head, I think subconsciously the survivors and their journey and the things that I learned from that actually translate into this children's book that never was meant to be this support. It was supposed to be this just precious story for Reagan. And now I'm going, wait a minute, you see that, right? And someone told me the other day, they're like, are you Fresno in the book? And I thought, what are you talking about? I'm not, no. Yeah, that's my kid's toy. And they said, no, but look at Fresno. He's a skeleton stripped of everything, right? I was stripped of, I had multiple miscarriages, kind of lost my motherhood identity. I lost my husband. My wife identity was gone. I suffered a career devastation. My career was gone. And so they said, you were stripped to everything. And then you started to rebuild and learn that you can be this loved, valuable, right, successful person as something new. And it's from people telling you that you're loved and that you're valuable and those types of things. And so, yeah, it's just what I never thought that was going to translate into this precious kids book about a skeleton and his best friend Reagan. So it came full circle.
Yeah, I think we don't realize when we put something out there, especially something creatively driven from something, from catharsis, we don't realize what kind of ripple effects it will have. Mm-hmm. And I have a feeling that your book will continue to make a difference. What I got out of it is kind of what you're saying, like, you don't have to be afraid of people that are different from mm-hmm. you, because they have their own specialness. Mm-hmm. And the monster under the bed thing for kids, I mean, that was just so great. Really, really great.
And now she's sitting at the kitchen table, right? Having tea with them and
exactly. Playing with them. Mm-hmm. Instruments. I was like, yeah, exactly. We don't have to be afraid of something just because it's unknown. It's mysterious. Right. We can, kind of just give it the benefit of the doubt and see what's special, because we all bring something special to the table.
Yeah, absolutely.
I really thank you so much for all the work that you're doing and everything that you're bringing to the world with your special passions and knowledge base, the criminology piece. It's important. It's a needed piece. We need more than just the detectives and investigators and science criminology people to help the community. And I can really get that that's what you're doing.
Thank you.
Keep doing it.
Thank you so much.
And I'm looking forward to Fresno's next episode.
Yes.
What other kinds of adventures Fresno and Reagan are going to get into.
Sit tight. So right now in the Bone Boutique online, you can snag the book, you can snag the plush doll and the puzzles. There's kids puzzles. And one of the cool things about the puzzles is if you're trying to talk about something really difficult with a child, letting their hands be kind of, busy and letting their minds kind of be distracted, you can have amazing conversations with children. So that was one of the things that prompted the puzzles.
Great.
Yeah, was to allow, read the book, start working on the puzzles and say, have you ever felt like Fresno? Has there ever been a time people weren't very nice to you? Have you ever felt out of place? But if I'm consumed with a project, I'm more likely to kind of share vulnerable things with you because I'm not having to look at you and tell you these things. So we have that. And then in the works, we have Fresno's First Christmas. We have some other little adventures of Fresno and a few new characters that are going to kick off some other series in the next year or two. So stay tuned.
I love it.
Yep. Follow us on social media and on the website, and join our wacky skeleton crew. It'll be great.
Yes, indeed. And we'll have links to all of that in the show notes, including the plush doll, which I see over your shoulder.
Oh.
And I love that puzzle idea. I remember I was in therapy and my therapist wouldn't let me bring a cup of coffee in because it was a way to distract.
Mhm.
But what you're saying makes better sense. Like
Yeah.
maybe if I was able to not have to, stare my crap in the face, I would have been more willing to talk about it.
Yeah, that's what art therapy is about. That's what music therapy is about. That's what play therapy is about. So especially with kids, instead of saying, "Hey, Reagan, do you want to go to a therapy appointment?" It's much easier to say, "Reagan, do you want to go create some art today?" Right? Or do you want to build a puzzle? And then I don't really let her know I need to ask her difficult questions. They just come up in conversation, or I say "Oh yeah, there was this one time that I felt like this. Have you ever felt like that?" And when she's busy, she's not thinking I don't know that I want to be vulnerable with her, right? She'll just answer me. And so maybe she's not ready to talk. So it doesn't always work. That's not a promise, but it does allow for kind of a different setting and a less intense and direct approach.
Yeah, absolutely. We talked about some pretty deep stuff today and some pretty dark stuff today. But what absolutely is sticking with me from our first conversation and now is the light inside of you. And I just really thank you and appreciate you for coming on and just sharing who you are, what you're about, what you're committed to, what you've been through, and how it can help other people.
Thanks so
much for being with us
Yes,
today.
thank you for letting me share my story. And it gets better. Just keep going, everybody. No matter what you're going through, one day at a time, as long as you put one foot in front of the other, you've done a great job. So give yourself grace and give grace to those around you.
Beautiful. Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of Trista's Plate Story Podcast. Please subscribe to Trista's Plate Story Podcast to get the story behind all those vanity plates driving with you on the road. And if you would like to nominate the owner of a license plate, including you, or visit any of our partners and sponsors, come and see us at platestory.com. That's PL8STORY.com and give us the details. If you enjoyed this episode, please drop a review and give us a share. I'm Trista Polo, wishing you well on the road to your next adventure.